Dr. Ann Willis is the California Regional Director of the American Rivers, a national conservation organization dedicated to the restoration and protection of rivers throughout our country. Dr. Willis's team leads river restoration projects from the Sierra Nevada to the Pacific and from Mexico to Oregon borders, and collaborates with her colleagues to translate on-the-ground projects to national policy. Prior to working at American Rivers, Dr. Willis led a research program at UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, where she worked closely with NGOs, state and federal agencies, and private landowners to guide watershed-scale conservation strategies on working lands. Her research focused on rivers throughout California's Central Valley, North Coast, and Klamath. It included topics from managing stream thermal regimes through conservation and dam regulation, climate change impacts on environmental flows and flood control operations, and aligning environmental flow policy with hydropower production. She has also worked at Watercourse Engineering, a private environmental engineering firm, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Sacramento District. She was awarded the National Science Foundation Fellowship to pursue a doctoral degree in 2016 at Headwater Eco. Sorry, I'm reading off a screen. I don't usually do this. She was also named a John Muir Institute for the Environmental Fellow for Innovations in Science Communication and a Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center Fellow for her research looking at headwater streams and the relationship to downstream water resources. And she currently serves as an alternate to the Klamath River Renewal Corporation Board of Directors. It's a pleasure to have Ann here to wrap us all up today. Thank you.
I'm just getting my clock. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to be included with this panel of speakers, though I have to admit I'm not sure how much of a gift it is to be the last one, so bear with me. Hi, I'm Dr. Ann Willis, and as I look out across this audience, I see so many familiar faces, and so I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that the reason I'm here is because you were with me, you were my partner, you helped support me through my career, and that's what it takes to move a woman up into leadership, a community who's willing to support and encourage and invest in her. So thank you. Thank you. I've had a lot of different jobs. I feel like I have a lot of different jobs right now as well, and that's okay. But sometimes it can be hard to remember what the core of my purpose is. And purpose matters to me a great deal. It's the thing that helps drive every decision I make, whether it's about my career or myself. And I come from a purpose-driven family, and I would say our purposes have generally been defined by generational crises. My dad was born in 1927 in Greece, and so his generational crisis was growing up through the Nazi occupation of Athens. That's how he came of age and then was conscripted into the military. My mother was born in 1938 in South Africa, and so her generational crisis was apartheid and what that meant for her expressing herself politically in a family that disagreed with her. And ultimately for both of my parents, it meant losing their homes, losing their families, losing the place they came from and coming here. When I think about my generational crisis, it's climate change. I think a lot of people would agree it's climate change. And when I say generational crisis, I'm talking about something that really, there's no single solution, there's no single person. It's really an act of faith to dedicate yourself to this purpose and trust that the community around you will similarly dedicate itself, and together, this is when the big achievements will be realized. So I want to take a moment during my talk to ground myself and the rest of us in the why of what we do, and who it is who has really been formative guides to me in doing this work. So knowing that climate change is my generational crisis, why rivers? How does that connect? Now this is going to be a slightly interactive portion of the talk. What's the problem with climate change? It's greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. Well, do we have alternatives to fossil fuels? Yes, we do. Can anyone name one? Doesn't have to be green, just any alternative to fossil fuels.
Bike.
I'm sorry?
Ride a bike.
That could be a small scale. Yeah, alternative, absolutely. How about anything else? Nuclear, biofuel, solar, hydropower, wind, geothermal, hydrogen. Okay, I'm not even a climate scientist, and many of us aren't, and we just named 8 alternatives. Name an alternative to water.
Wait to see what's on Mars.
I just learned a lot about some of you. There isn't one. There isn't one. Now, from one perspective, that can be a truth that's devastating, that inspires despair. But I see it from a slightly different perspective, because when you have a huge, global, complex, living problem, and there's no alternative, well, then what that says to me is that there is a beautifully simplified solution. We don't have to worry about what alternatives we try. There's only one. When people think about rivers in California, they may imagine a map like this. Some major arteries moving through the state, most of them located up north. Even this map itself is misleading because it gives the impression that they flow. And occasionally they do. But as scientists, we have a much deeper and richer understanding of what rivers in California look like. They look like this. They're everywhere. California has 189,000 miles of river. That is more river miles than any state of the nation except Alaska. Most people in the country live within a mile of a river, and they don't know it. I did growing up. It turns out my river was 3 houses down from the house where I grew up. It was in a little stone channel. I grew up on the East Coast, so we called it a brook. Rivers are foundational to every part of our daily lives, whether we're aware of them or not. Not only does California have the most river miles of any other state in the contiguous US, we have a beautiful diversity of rivers. Now, this is some work that was done by Belize Lane and her collaborators back in 2017, where they just wanted to ask the question, if we wanted to categorize our rivers by the types of flow and their duration, what would that look like? And in their paper, they identified 8 classes of rivers, distinguished by whether it was snowmelt or rainfall runoff, whether they were perennial, whether they were ephemeral, their volume. And what does this diversity of flow give us? What does it look like? It's one thing to look at a schematic. It's another thing to watch the living being. Most of these pictures, except for the last one, the first 2 are actually from last spring. So the muddy one is Mud Canyon Road. That's down in Southern California, and that was right after Hurricane Hillary. That's a river whose lifetime is measured in hours, maybe days. The middle picture is the South Fork of the Yuba. It's flowing at about 80 times what its natural base flow was, because it's moving a gigantic pulse of snowmelt out of its system, the way it's supposed to. And on the far side, that's Big Springs Creek. That was, I would say, my first conservation river. Not my first river, but it definitely was my first conservation river. And it was so interesting to watch that river year after year after year and never really see a trace of rainfall runoff in its hydrology or snowmelt in its hydrology. It's entirely water pumped out of the ground. It's like a metronome. This diversity of rivers means that we have a diversity of life in California that's nearly unparalleled. The Nature Conservancy put out a really lovely, lovely report, I think this was 2010, where we were just looking at, they were looking at the species richness specific to freshwater. And there's so much of it. And it's concentrated in places like the headwaters of the Sierra Nevada, the North Coast, the Bay Area, less so in Southern California, but when we think about how those rivers are more ephemeral, it makes a little bit more sense. But the thing that makes California so special, and California is very, very special. I love California. Our life isn't just diverse, it's unique. So the specialness of what we do means that when we are conserving rivers, we are conserving life that is found no place else on the planet. This means that California is a global biodiversity hotspot. I love bringing this figure up when I'm talking to my colleagues at American Rivers who run regions throughout the country, and they're all excited about where they work, and I'm like, that's nice. California is crucial to much of the life that we value. So how do we get an understanding of what these relationships are, what these life connections are? You know, when I first met Tommy Williams, he said something that really crystallized an idea that I hadn't been able to articulate. He said, we often talk about rivers as a sum of parts, like a car engine, and it isn't. It is a living body that is filled with working processes. That is absolutely right. That is absolutely right. Yeah, we can applaud Tommy. Well done. My introduction to the idea of rivers as a connected network of processes didn't start with Tommy. It actually started with someone who might be familiar to some of you. Yeah. This is Jim Siddell. Jim Siddell passed away in 2012. When I met him, I was a brand new conservation scientist, really at the beginning of my career. He was at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and he had this vision for conservation that was completely fueled by the insights we could gain from science, but a very particular kind of science. It was a science that recognized that fish were part of a larger aquatic community, and effective conservation meant understanding how various parts interacted. That's from a really lovely tribute that was published about him in 2012. They're part of a larger aquatic community. We have to understand how various parts interact. What does that mean? How did Jim put this concept into practice? How did he translate science into impactful conservation? Well, he did it by funding science. He funded a lot of science. He was really good at it. My particular area of expertise was contributing to the research on stream temperature. I didn't even have good waiters back then. But what Jim understood was that if we wanted to address a stream whose main issue was stream temperature, we couldn't just put out a network of loggers and then analyze data on a computer seasons later without any context of what's happening around it. Jim understood we had to also monitor stream flow. We had to monitor biological elements. You know, that's a drone we use to map aquatic vegetation growth. We had to monitor fish. That was my very first field trip to Big Springs Creek with my friend and colleague Carson Jeffries, and he asked me if I wanted to dive with him, and I was like, I'll stay with the dog. It was only by having an investment in science that was this holistic, that understood that any one part we want to fix depends on understanding how all the parts work together. That's how we were able to take the science we were doing, publish a lot of papers, but not just stop there. It wasn't enough to publish the paper. What Jim always encouraged us to do is take the next step and then communicate it to the person who needs to make a decision. What restoration strategy? Is it a fence? Is it riparian restoration? Is it barrier removal? What's the thing that's going to give us the most impact? Because as we've heard, there isn't always enough money to do all the things. And if we want to keep getting more money, then we have to show that we understand how to invest it effectively. I'm really grateful that I was part of a team that thought about conservation science in that way, and that I was able to learn from Jem about what it means to take that and translate it into conservation. When I moved to UC Davis, I had the great privilege of listening to Katharine Hayhoe speak. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her. She's one of the most brilliant climate scientists in the world. She is an evangelical Christian. She sees no tension between those two identities, primarily because she's Canadian. And so science and religion aren't weaponized in the same way that they have been here. And her message is consistently the single most important thing that anyone, not just me, but literally anyone can do to bring people together is ironically the thing we fear the most. Talk about it. So let's talk a little bit about climate change. It may feel like there still aren't enough people who understand the gravity of what we're facing, the immediacy of what we're experiencing. But that's not what the science says. Science says that 50% of adults in the US are alarmed or concerned about climate change. That doesn't count the rest of the people who are along the spectrum all the way up to maybe skeptical, but open to hearing it. When we think of that whole spectrum, it's about 93% of people feel strongly that climate change is an issue. 7 out of 10 say they wish they could do something about it, but half don't even know where to start. A third of them say they talk about climate change maybe occasionally. And almost none of them think it's going to affect them personally. That says something. Because it says there's a disconnect between what we know in this room as scientists and the people we are trying to serve with our work. It isn't always helpful to use the phrase climate change. I've worked a long time in Siskiyou County. Without making too broad a judgment, I found that there are better phrases that immediately move us away from argument and into conversation. Phrases like extreme drought. They know what that is. Extreme and more frequent floods. Those are more of my Central Valley colleagues. Catastrophic wildfire. These are things they see and live with and experience every day. This is something where when I talk with people in the community, I talk about this. It helps them feel seen. It helps them feel like they have a place where they can engage with me. I don't want somebody to feel like they need a PhD in environmental science to understand the work I do or the importance of what we're trying to do together. I want them to understand that they're experiencing these effects immediately and that there's something we can do about it. The sad truth is, in our moment right now, California may have some of the most beautiful and rich display of biodiversity in the world. It also has the most imperiled biodiversity of any state in the contiguous United States. This hurts my heart. This hurts my heart because I think about what I can do, whether I'll see the other side of any of this. Feels a little unlikely. You know, in February 2022, I was still at UC Davis, and the latest round of IPCC climate reports were coming out. Those are reports released every 4 years. They talk about the state of the science of climate change. And scientists were being brought together so that we could have a consistent message about what these reports mean. It's not new science, it's just a review of the thousands of pages of science that have been published in the previous 4 years. And the message that the editor of the water chapter wanted us to take away had 3 parts. He was like, 1, there's no good news. And I was like, is that science? 2, he said, we're locked in to climate change for the next 30 to 50 years. If we stopped what we were doing today and did everything we know we needed to do right now, it would take that long to see us bend the curve. And that one really stopped me because I started to do the math, and I was like, 30 to 50 years, that's probably the rest of my life. I will never see the other side of this. And that's what reminded me of the importance, not just of faith, but confidence in the work that we do. I also knew that his next point was the most important point. There's still a chance, and we know what we need to do. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to be mindful of the risk of centering myself. Because it's not me who's going to experience the most extreme consequences of climate change. It's communities of color. It's Native nations and indigenous peoples. It's people who live in poverty. This matters to me a lot because I see my role, one of my important duties, as being a voice for rivers. But I also see it as a part of my duty to amplify people whose voices come from rivers. They're not mine. And for that, I actually have one more example I'd love to share. This is a good friend and colleague of mine, Kava Mandani. He and I met when I did my graduate work for my master's at UC Davis. At the time, he was doing his PhD, and he was just starting to make the connection between water policy, water resources, and game theory. Now he's fairly renowned. That work is recognized around the world as foundational for how we make decisions and multiple political lessons about water and rivers. At the time, we were trying to understand how he was going to turn it into a coherent qualifying exam. He did. What I admire so deeply about Kava is he's Iranian, and in 2017, he was appointed as the deputy head of Iranians, basically their federal environmental agency. And he went back. This was an appointment that was recognized in media worldwide because it was so remarkable to see an example of reverse brain drain from Iran. People whose homeland it was, who were extremely highly educated, who were going back into this political morass to try and make things better. And he wasted no time. I often hear it's not a scientist's job to make policy. I don't know who came up with that, because I disagree. 100% I disagree. To what end are we doing our work if it's not to inform the policies that will then apply and touch every person who live in these areas? Kava didn't agree either, and so he was able to masterfully make the connection between things like international sanctions against nuclear development and the environmental consequences for people who live near rivers in Iran. He was able to, before we all started talking about microplastics like a buzzword, talk about plastic pollution and turning off the plastic pipeline into the rivers in Iran. He went around the world delivering this message not just to the people in his home nation, but to people around the world, to give a different picture of what it could mean to do this work. And then he experienced what happens when you challenge an entity that relies so heavily on the status quo. Some of you may remember in 2018, there were some news stories about an Iranian environmentalist who often took students out. He had been arrested, interrogated, and died. About a week later, Kava was arrested and interrogated and released. And then he went into hiding for some months. It wasn't possible for any of us who knew him to express our support because it would only reinforce this ridiculous narrative that somehow by serving his nation with science, he was a spy. Now Kava works as the director for the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health and is on the East Coast. And so he's continuing his work of making these really deep connections between science and policy. And now it's not just for his country, it's for everybody around the world. And it may be tempting to think that this is a situation that's isolated out there. But it isn't. About a week ago, this story was posted. It seemed funny at the time. And then I actually read it because I'm curious where people's fear is coming from. I don't tend to read stories like this for information, but I read it because what I find in it is the seed of fear. And this fear was so extreme that the narrative that people were concluding was that somehow American rivers, through our involvement with the Klamath Dam renewals, were trying to undermine the integrity of the 2024 election, specifically by disenfranchising conservative voters. Would I were that powerful? But this is not where our greatest challenge comes from. This is actually, to me, not the crux of the problem. I'm going to quote Catherine Hayhoe again. The biggest challenge we face isn't science denial. It's a combination of tribalism, complacency, and fear. And what I love about that quote is it puts the responsibility not on the people who are developing and promoting misinformation, but on the people who stay silent. This paper is the reason I'm at American Rivers. This was one of the last pieces of research that I completed before leaving. It was research where we just asked the question, temperature is so important. We say we can recreate natural thermal regimes with dams. Can we? Turns out the answer is not really. And there are tremendous implications for that, for the kind of conservation and regulatory work that's done, particularly in a state like California, where salmon and salmon conservation is big business, and so is water. Rather than engage on the merits of the science and what we can do with this new knowledge, this paper prompted a very personal attack, to the point where a particular individual wrote to the journal demanding it be retracted and vilifying not just the work we did, but myself and my colleagues as people. It took 9 months. It took a rebuttal paper that was even longer than the initial paper that we submitted and was published. It took doing all of the scientific analysis that a person criticizing work like this ought to have done to be taken seriously in the first place, and didn't. And in the end, what did we find? That in an entire statewide network of data, we had overlooked one outlier. We wrote to the editor and we said, there's a single sentence in here that says exclusively. We should change that word to mainly because there's a single outlier. That was our mistake. That's it. The amount of time, that is what merchants of doubt take from us. It's our time. Because when we need to sit playing inside baseball, it's so important because people out there don't understand it. They're not here. They don't have PhDs in this work. They're not practitioners. They trust that information coming from people they know is credible. That's why somebody can take a single sample from a river right after a dam has been removed, compare it to drinking water standards, and say, there's an emergency. And the rest of us are like, actually, that's just what we expected to happen all along. And the tragedy is, just as Mike and Mark were saying, that we didn't equate the same kind of environmental degradation that was occurring for years with what's occurring now, and have a similar level of concern and outrage. I decided with this paper, and after that experience, responding to that commenter, that there was something more I could do. Rather than just being the scientist who informed the decision maker, I could just skip that middleman and be the decision maker. That's right. And I still get to do science anyway. So what are we doing? What are we doing? Well, I had a little fun with this next section, so indulge me. We take action with science, and that action can look like a lot of different things. It can look like conservation projects that we implement. It can look like communication that we do, not just through media, but directly to communities. It can look like policy. For the work we're doing with American Rivers, I will say thank you to my friend Miranda Tilcock, who texted me this picture and was like, you look like Greta Gerwig. And I was like, oh, we're going to run with this one. What are we going to do? We're going to protect 1 million miles of rivers between now and 2030 across the nation. Impossible? Imperative. Imperative. Impossible because this is simply what's possible in alignment with all of the 30 by 30 conservation work that's already going on. We're just going to name it. This is what we're doing. We're going to remove 30,000 dams by 2050. This is another one where people say impossible, and I say inevitable, because we are very, very good at building things, and we are very, very bad at maintaining them. And when a thing outlives its useful life, and there are so many better ways to provide a service without necessarily replacing the structure, then we don't need it anymore. And 30,000 dams is numbers we've identified of dams that today are already obsolete. And the sad fact is, if we don't remove them, degraded infrastructure removes itself. Wouldn't it be better to do it on the front end of that problem? Yes, it would. This one makes me smile. When I came to American Rivers, I have to admit, I am so grateful to have come to an organization after it has completed its strategic planning effort. I was like, just give me the book. Like, it's fine. And I said, okay, we want to reconnect and restore 30,000 acres of floodplains by 2050. And I was like, in California? They were like, no, nationally. And I was like, it's handled. Because when I just look at what my team alone has going today, it's 5,600 acres of floodplain we're reconnecting. And then when I think of what all of you are doing, and I add that up, I'm like, so we're done. And when we talk about floodplains, we're not just talking about, major floodplains in the Central Valley. We're trying to expand people's vision of floodplains to include our headwater meadows. Somebody asked a question about hydropower. I couldn't see across the room. We can't always remove a dam, but we can reoperate them. We want to protect 10,000 miles of rivers through hydropower reform. And in California, we have a tremendous opportunity because in the next 10 years, there are 110 projects coming up for relicensing. The goal that the national team set for me personally in California was 5,000 miles. I'm like, on it. Because I'm with the rest of you. It's not something I'm doing alone. It's not something I'm just doing with a core staff. It's something I'm doing not just with a community, but we are a coalition of people who have a deep knowledge of these places and a deep commitment to each other. And we're also going one step further. where we're using science to inform policy. These are just a handful of bills that we're working on with congressional staff. And I'm really pleased with some of the details in them. The Community Hydropower Improvement Act, CHIA. Anybody who's a child of the 80s will maybe be amused by CHIA PAT. I was like, really? That's our acronym? Okay. But what I love about this is that's a bill that's being sponsored by a Republican senator with 2 Republican co-sponsors in addition to 2 Democratic ones. And it specifically writes in language so that FERC would be required to take into consideration climate change when it's re-licensing projects. Do we use the word climate change? We do not. We call it changed hydrology. Potato, potato. we got it. That was the win. We also have pieces of legislation in that same act that define a timeline for surrender process, because it's not just the hard projects that are taking 20 years. It's the easy ones where there's no meaningful opposition that are also taking 20 years. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And we can solve it. We work with agencies like the Forest Service and the National Park Service where we say, isn't managing this land that's divided into a checkerboard of mandates difficult? What if we just consolidated it through a one-to-one land swap? Would that make your lives easier? Yes, it would. Senator Padilla is running that bill for us to simplify, because we have science that shows what makes these things better. But even more importantly than this so far is the inside baseball. But I think this is the part that really matters. It's using our platforms to give the opportunity to other people to tell their story about why this matters to them. That could be through movies. It could be through telling the story of people who live with the river. It can be a story about the river itself. It can be our story. Because by telling our story, what we do is we take a person who may initially want to react to their idea of us, and instead we humanize ourselves so they connect to who we are. And that is the first step of making a genuine connection with the people who we're going to need to achieve these really important goals. So I'll ask the question again, do we as scientists compromise our integrity by engaging in arenas that go beyond science? By being conservation leaders, by being public communicators, by being policymakers? I don't think we lose our integrity, but I think by not doing that work, we lose our chance. We lose our chance to do more. We lose our chance to be impactful. And the one thing I know for sure is that there's really only one truly non-renewable resource, and it's time. And we don't know how much we have. So I find it freeing to remember that and give up the idea of seeing the other side and just remember that what my job is today. It's to do all that I can today. The best and highest use of my time today was to come share this time and space with you. And the best and highest use of my time going forward is to continue sharing this space with you and the communities we're working with to make rivers better, to heal them. Because in doing so, we're not just conserving rivers. We're not just healing each other, but we're fundamentally saving life itself. Because life depends on rivers. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time.